Supposed to
Good evening. I'd like to call the order the Thursday, September 26th meeting of the Woodland Park Planning Commission. Roll call, please.
Sure. Chair Hartsfield,
Here.
Vice Chair Brown,
be here.
Don DeSalem,
Present.
Jared Newcomb,
Here.
Ken Kennedy,
Present by Zoom.
Larry Larson,
Here.
Don Hoyne. Oh, absent. Cole Middleton is absent. We also have in attendance Mayor Pro Tem Catherine McKay.
Very good. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. For tonight's meeting, we have a work session to review the code review project. And Karen, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. We have three main things that we want to touch base on this evening. The first is, oh, there's Commissioner Brown. I was like, where'd he go? Sorry. The first is what was in your packet, the work product related to how subdivisions are classified under our current code, and then the process associated with the different types, and the confusion that we have around what those are. And then there's a suggestion in terms of how to restructure those. So that's the first one, is subdivisions. The second one is I put an extra sheet in front of everyone's spot here. Ken, I will email that to you here momentarily. That addresses extensions of permits. You all have seen from processing those that some things get 1-year extensions, some things get 2. It's a little all over the place. So just to touch base on what that currently looks like, and hopefully get some direction for staff as we get ready to draft that portion of the administration chapter. And then the third thing we want to touch upon is just the PUD process in general. We've been kind of avoiding that elephant, and we'll just talk a little bit more in depth about what that currently is, and then where we're going to head with that as far as drafting that particular part of the administration chapter. So with that, I'm going to let Jen, do you want to talk next about this, the subdivisions?
Yeah, I was wondering if you want me to share my screen so everyone can, I know everyone has it in front of them, but would you like me to share my screen
Sure.
with all the documentation? Okay.
Sure.
Okay, I think we're sharing now.
Yep, we can see it.
Perfect. All right, Karen, would you like me to just kind of walk through the current process? And I guess let's talk about the format for this evening. Do we want to just walk through each of the current processes and then get to the recommendations and have discussion? Do you think that might be a good path?
Yes.
Okay. So currently you have, we've talked in the past about major subdivision and minor subdivision. I know we had addressed those or visited those a little bit during the definitions review. Some of the other subdivision processes that are in the current code are a conditional minor subdivision, condominiums and townhomes, which have a kind of a separate process, alterations or amendments or plat changes, an exemption plat, and then vacation or establishment of lot lines and public easements. So those are all your various processes at the moment. You can see in this table, we have a little bit to the right, you'll see the sketch plan, preliminary plat, final plat, and other column. There's a couple of things down lower, and then who the appeal authority is. I'm going to start with a minor subdivision for the definition, because a minor subdivision is any re-subdivision of any existing subdivision fronting on an existing street, not involving any new street or road or the extension of municipal facilities, or the creation of any public improvements, and not adversely affecting the remainder of the parcel or adjoining property, and not in conflict with any provision or portion of the comprehensive plan zoning ordinance or this code. And the reason I started with that is because then a major subdivision is defined as anything that is not classified as a minor subdivision, including any size subdivision requiring any new street or extension of municipal facilities or the creation of any public improvements. And both of them go through a very similar process. The major subdivision and minor subdivision both have a sketch plan that's reviewed by the staff, by the planning director. A major subdivision goes through a preliminary plat process that's reviewed by staff. Recommendation comes to planning commission at a public hearing, and then city council makes the final decision at a public hearing. Minor subdivision does not have that preliminary plat step. They both have a final plat that goes through review at the staff level, recommendation at a public hearing with planning commission, and then decision at a public hearing with city council. The conditional minor subdivision, are there any questions about that? We've kind of talked about that one before, so I think it's fairly straightforward. We're good? Okay. Conditional minor subdivision allows early construction of model homes, and a final plat for 5 lot maximum is processed currently with a preliminary plat for a larger subdivision. Existing street required, no improvements required. This one we'll talk a little bit more about later, but the process for that is simply a final plat. That can be used, I believe, Karen, for early construction of model homes. Is it only for model homes, or can it also be used for a small filing of a larger subdivision?
No, the code is actually, as it's currently written, specific to model homes.
Perfect.
And that's where Jen and I talked a little bit about that's not a great way to do that because it's not really enforceable. The bottom line is you're creating lots that get recorded that somebody can sell. I mean, that was probably the intent, to be able to concurrently process a small final plat, you know, when a situation where it doesn't require new infrastructure. You're working off an existing street, an existing infrastructure. Let's go ahead and get a couple of lots in there so the builder, you know, if they're doing a large development, could do a couple of model homes. But yeah, it's got other built-in problems.
So you're suggesting just removing that?
Our suggestion actually is going to be within like the major subdivision to potentially set up that ability to concurrently process a first filing, you know, on a small scale like that, that meets that kind of criteria. That would be the proposed way to address that without the built-in issues. So, okay, Jen.
All right. Condominiums and townhomes, new projects must include a site plan. This just has a final plat that goes through a staff review and then appeal to city council.
I do want to add into that, if for some reason the piece of property was not previously platted, that's when you see a subdivision come, you know, a preliminary and final plat. A good example of that is the townhomes at Brecken Heights, that there was an initial subdivision that created a couple of large parcels. And then there was a townhome plat that came back through for duplexes on a couple of those lots, if I recall. So.
All right. There's an alteration or amendment or plat change process. And this is just where you can make a change to an approved and recorded plat. They must be approved by Planning Commission and City Council, subject to the same process as the initial request. So you'll see here, the final plat is what you would be looking at in that case. So it's a review by the staff, recommendation by Planning Commission at a public hearing, and then a decision by City Council at a public hearing. Then we have an exemption plat. And this definition is in the code currently as a map indicating a proposed division of land considered exempt from the term subdivision as defined in this code. It shall be prepared by a Colorado registered land surveyor in accordance with the provisions of this code. And if approved by the governing body of the area, the aforementioned plat shall be recorded by the county clerk and recorder. This is a fully administrative process. So there's a sketch plan that comes through with staff and then a final plat. And Karen, do you want to expand upon that one at all? Or is that good?
I think that's okay.
Okay.
The part where it's a little challenging for both of these, the alteration or amendment and then the exemption plat, is there's not clear criteria as to what falls into what category. So if somebody's really pushing us in terms of why is it this one, why is it that one, I don't have anything great to point to right now. But that is what it is, but you'll see we have a suggestion as to how to better address that. And then this last section, all I can do is speculate, since I wasn't here when that was developed. And I've seen things partially similar in another location. And I think this was a way to create an easier process for somebody to make a small change to a subdivision or a plat or a couple of lots within a subdivision without having to go through a public process. So this is completely handled at a staff level. The vacating interior lot line without an easement. Other places I've used what's called a combining lot covenant. So for the purposes of wanting to build a single home on two lots, like over that common property line, that covenant gets acknowledged and recorded that says, hey, for the purpose of the setbacks, blah, 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 that we ignore that line. So the two lots technically still exist, but the development is otherwise restricted around that particular covenant that gets recorded. That they're treated as one lot for the purposes of development at that point. Other places I've worked when you're vacating or extinguishing an easement, or establishing easements, and vacating right away is definitely spelled out in another section of code. It's like it's title 5 or 7. But I'm used to seeing that done as part of a plat, part of public review. Something that involves, planning commission, potentially city council. So I thought this was interesting that Woodland Park's been doing that through this very low level administrative process that gets looked at by staff. And then there is a document that does get recorded in the real property records. But it typically is not including or not required to include an exhibit. Which since plats are so graphic, you really almost kind of need that. So anyhow, that's an interesting thing.
All right. Should we move on to the proposed?
Oh, actually, questions from
Or do you-
anybody else
Questions,
here?
yeah, questions on these last couple of items.
On a major subdivision, we'll have a preliminary plat, and then there could be modifications before we go to the minor plat. Is that addressed in the alterations or amendments, or is that an overlap? Or
What do you? I'm not quite following you.
so we have alterations or amendments as one process, but if they go through a major subdivision, they're going to submit a preliminary plat, and so any modifications. The final plat's never 100%, rarely 100% the same.
Well, and
So
here how it's spelled out. It says alteration or amendment. It's explained that that's to an approved and recorded plat. What you guys have seen recently has been somebody getting through a preliminary plat stage and then deciding, oh, wait, I want to amend this, or I want to see if I can get
After it's been finalized. Okay.
more density. So it's still at the preliminary plat phase where you've seen that. You've not had somebody come back in and ask to amend a final plat.
Can I ask, We're in the process is the city council's approval of multifamily projects.
Give me more context, please.
If in a multifamily district, suburban or urban, in order to put a multifamily development in, the city council is required to approve it. It's all conditions.
That's a conditional use permit.
So that's simply a conditional use permit.
Yes.
If they're gonna sell them off as individual units, then there would be a subdivision process. But that would require probably a major subdivision or something.
And I was wondering too, because there's a site plan, the city council gives a conditional use permit with a particular site plan. A new site plan is administrative only, does the conditional use permit still continue? How do those things interrelate?
So if somebody is proposing multifamily, do you want it like an apartment building, or do you want to talk
Well,
townhomes?
let's say it was a townhouse or condominium, because there's particular reference here to condominiums and townhouses.
Yeah,
It appears to, I mean, obviously zoning has to be right, but it appears to suggest that the approval is an administrative approval.
of the plat, not the use getting there. So from our use table, I'm sure you guys recall that to do any type of multifamily housing in, especially the multifamily zone districts, that requires a conditional use permit. So let's say it's already a platted, one large platted parcel, and somebody wants to do a townhome development or condominium, a couple, multifamily or multi-story apartment buildings. That would go through a conditional use permit process to get the conditional use permit in place. And then the actual condominium plat, that could be handled just at an administrative level, the way our code is currently written. But we wouldn't process that plat without the use being in place.
Actually, the condominiums and townhouses on the table we just here has it as both a D under staff. And then, okay, the C is an appeal to the council.
Yes. Yeah, because of how that's currently worded, if the developer is not able to resolve any questions or concerns that arise through the review process, if they're not able to resolve that at a staff level, they can request to have city council, appeal any findings or recommendations that or requirements that have come out at the staff level. I swear that's how it's written in the code. You're just looking at me like, what?
Go ahead, thank you.
So, and there are instances, Jen and I have talked about this before, that townhomes, a lot of times, because you're dealing with a lot of times a area of land associated with the unit, that's sometimes, seen or processed, or at least processed at a staff level. But there are plenty of places where the condominium plat, you're dealing with a building that already exists. And that's a mechanism for being able to sell what we call airspace units. So within that, and it really is about identifying the location of unit like 2A versus 2B, 2C, so that it's a mechanism that gets recorded so that when you're selling that unit, it's a reference point for what that airspace unit is that somebody is buying. So those, there are places where that's not even seen at a staff level, that's just handled probably through the attorneys and whoever's drawing the documents for the developer and getting those recorded. And that's set up that's possible under state law. Did I get that right, Jen?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Well, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, So anyhow, this is how things are now here in Woodland Park. This is how things are spelled out. And they said, one of my bigger concerns when we were looking at this, and we're getting ready to, of course, write process, so that's hopefully succinct and clear and easy for the developers, the general public to follow in terms of what is it we do with these applications. That they said some of these distinctions between these things is really not very clear, even to us as seasoned planners. So it's like, okay, how can we move this back towards more what I would like to call industry standards, more common ways of processing things, more common ways of distinguishing between what these are. So that was page 2 of that handout in your packet, where we have devised 3 primary categories and work to better articulate the distinctions between them, and just, you know, what happens there. So if you want to lead on into this, Jen, I'll let you take over.
Awesome. And yeah, like Karen said, this kind of proposal here is very common in a lot of codes to have you'll see kind of the distinction between a major and a minor is at the 4 lots. So a minor subdivision is where you're creating 4 or fewer lots, typically where there is, let's see, such as proposes or requires public infrastructure to be constructed in association with the subdivision, in which case the subdivision shall be classified as, oh, that's what I was just going to say, sorry, unless such application proposes. So a minor subdivision typically is 4 lots or less where there's no public dedication. So there's no public right of way associated with that. If you have 4 lots or less and there is a public right of way or some public dedication, it would be considered a major subdivision. And then anything above 4 lots, so 5 lots or more, would always be a major subdivision regardless of that public infrastructure. So in this case, we have a minor subdivision, as I've just described, with a sketch plan that would go through a staff review, fairly standard. And then the final plat that would be similar to what you have now, review by staff. Planning Commission does a recommendation at planning or at a public hearing, and City Council does a decision at public hearing. Then your major subdivision, like I said, would be creating 4 or more new lots or less than 4 lots with public infrastructure being proposed. And then we have a definition here of what public infrastructure would include: water and sewer lines and stubs, drainage facilities, electric facilities, lines and facilities, whether above or below ground for television, telephone, internet, or other type or form of data transfer, curb and gutters, sidewalk, common access areas such as shared driveways, and any other type of facility deemed by the director to be reasonably necessary to support the residents, users, or owners of the lots. And the process that we have spelled out here is sketch plan with review with staff, and then your preliminary plat. Looks like I've cut the top of this off a little bit. Preliminary plat goes to staff for review, Planning Commission for recommendation, and City Council for decision, and then your final plat would go through that same process. And I will say some final plats in some communities, they do administratively, assuming that the preliminary plat is a heftier document, and that at the final plat, you're just kind of checking that you've made those technical corrections. But I think given the nature of Woodland Park and how you have processed things in the past, Karen and I landed on continuing to take that final plat through the full hearing process. It would have to be signed off by City Council because of the public dedications anyway. And
So
then,
hang on.
go ahead. Yeah.
So essentially, major and minor subdivision, there's no change in the process. If you look at this compared to the first page, what is different is hopefully a little more clarity around what is the distinction between these two. What qualifies as a minor subdivision, what requires more scrutiny through the major subdivision process. So that is really the objective here. And we recognize that through some of this language and stuff here where that needs to carry over into the code as it's written and definitions and such. So we understand that. But like I said, because what we looked at previously is really not going to function
So for
great.
that point, you wouldn't put the public infrastructure definition only in the major subdivision section. It's also used in the minor subdivision. So you have to locate it so it applies to both.
Yeah, it would be
Maybe
appropriately
in a separate
referenced.
definition section, or maybe
Yeah.
at the bottom of this section or something.
Yeah, we would make sure it's easy to find.
Anyway, it's referred to in other sections of the code as well.
Yeah. So,
So does the conditional minor subdivision for the model homes, does that get rolled into the major or minor, or depends on the number of lots?
well, when you think about it in terms of a minor subdivision, you're skipping the preliminary plat. It's small enough, the scale, there's no infrastructure needs, so you're going straight into a final plat. So there's no need for that conditional minor or initial filing there. So it's really a component of the major subdivision. And I had that aha moment after this document went out to y'all. But recognizing that within the section we write on the major subdivisions, we can include that provision where somebody could potentially request that first filing at the preliminary plat stage, provided it met some basic requirements.
Clustered subdivisions are not necessarily major now. That was one of the changes.
Clustered subdivisions.
I just noted the previous major subdivision, 1712, that all clustered developments would be considered major subdivision. Did that-
Right. I would think a cluster subdivision would need to be, I mean, typically they're going to be a major. I think they just fall under the same designation of it's the 4 lots or more, or I mean, 4 lots or less or more than 4 lots. And if it's a cluster, most of your clusters are going to be more than 4 lots, I would think. So they would fall under the major, but not defining a distinction between, what am I trying to say? A cluster would be part of one of these 2 categories. Yes.
And we can make sure that gets spelled out. Thank you for
Yep.
highlighting that for us.
When you're talking about public infrastructure, when you talk about electrical facilities, include gas.
Okay.
Yeah, what are lines? Include lines and facilities.
When I typed this up, I might have dropped the word gas.
I'm wondering the same thing. Yeah. We're going to
Since-
add it in there in red.
Yeah.
There we go.
That's my guess looking at that.
I
Thank you
used
for
to like
catching
the
that.
kid when I talked about gas lines, I said, we didn't allow any above ground gas lines.
Yeah, and it's just, like I said, how it's written broadly. Because there's when you get into communication lines, depending upon the community and when it was developed and that kind of thing, sometimes you've got old phone and cable lines, above ground. So the intent was to capture, though, regardless of where they're located. And you all know that here in Woodland Park, when new developments are going in, it is required that those lines are all underground. So.
Any other questions on major and minor? These are great questions and comments.
Don't see any, so let's move on.
So
All right.
exemption. What this means is exempt from either one of those processes above. So exempt from the public hearing process. And so basically all those other odds and ends, this is where they land. So I'll let Jen dive into that some more.
Yeah. So this is where, like Karen's saying, this is kind of, I don't want to say your catch-all, but this is where anything that just does not need to go through that full process. So a correction plat, that's where you're correcting any technical errors. in an approved or recorded final plat that does not increase the number of subdivided lots, could include errors to legal descriptions, acknowledgements, dedication language, plat notes, and other items that do not constitute substantive modifications of the approved plat. This could also be a subdivision exemption, could be a revision to a boundary or lot line, like we were talking about earlier, that vacation of lot line or easement kind of language. So this would be where you have or a correction that does not increase the number. So it's typically where you have two parcels, maybe owned by the same person, and they want to build a structure kind of over the two lots, and they can remove that lot line, or maybe they just want to move a lot line over, but it's kind of between a couple of parcels, not increasing that number. It could even be on a, say, a minor subdivision, and they're just adjusting those lot lines a little bit to accommodate the product that they're planning. Let's see, townhouse lots, division of land to create individual townhouse lots, each to accommodate a single household attached dwelling unit. Does include clustered developments for the townhouse lot. Condominiums, a division of land created by complying with the provisions of the Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act. That's what Karen was kind of talking about earlier. And then lot combination, which would be consolidating contiguous parcels or lot mergers. So these are all kind of those minor types of things. This is all very, very common procedure across other communities, specifically in Colorado, but also, you know, outside of Colorado, just to have a process that allows for correction or just kind of a very small adjustment to a plat without it having to go back through the whole hearing process, as long as it just continues to meet all of the criteria and conditions and whatnot of the original approval. Any questions on that?
So, and I do want to note that as Jen just identified, under the townhouse lots, it lists clustered developments. I highlighted that for myself because I do want to go back and take a look at the specific criteria around clustered developments. And that, I think, will help guide us as to exactly where that needs to be. You know, to your point earlier, Lee, about is it a major subdivision? So I can't definitively answer that at the moment. And obviously there's a little bit of confusion, so we will unconfuse that.
Because cluster developments have a lot of specific conditions, and the inference is that there's some judgment used in approving them. It doesn't have a lot of specific language saying the city has to like it, but if you're putting in a cluster development, it kind of needs, well, it sounds to me like it's major almost always.
So, and we'll, like I said, it may be where it needs to be, and we'll make sure that we talk about that as we
One thing,
pull that out.
a comment, it's not specific to this section, but look at correction plats, i.e. open paren, i.e. errors to legal descriptions, blah, 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 etc. I think it's a bad idea in drafting to use parentheses and then say, start out parenthesis, then that is errors to legal. I think it's, you build it in the same sentence or build a new sentence after it, not a parenthetical.
Okay.
At least that's my impression of good drafting practice.
This is maybe just a bad typist to put it in the spreadsheet. That would be me. But thank you for that.
I mean, the second one, revision to boundary or lot lines or corrections that do not increase the number of subdivided lots, i.e. engineering or surveyor. If we mean to say this applies only to engineering and surveying errors, we should probably say that. Parenthetical is it's like a softer way to say it, so it's a little more vague.
Well, it could be other things that happen.
Well, then it means other things and don't say it. It means that is engineering or survey errors. Now you've limited it. If you mean, for example, you know, the revisions are meant to include matters such as engineering or surveying errors or other areas that don't substantially affect the house or something like that. Say what you mean.
Yeah, we could do that.
It has to specific, whereas EG is an example. I'm not recommending using an abbreviation, but for example, it means for example, which would allow other possibilities.
Okay,
Right. A lot of times we'll say included or not limited to. So along those same lines. Yeah. Good suggestion.
Don't unless you want to have people make fun of your text. Make fun of it. It's so lawyer-like to say, including without limitation, such and such.
Yeah, and back to the clustering, I know Karen said we'll need to kind of look into that a little bit more. I have your current code open on the other screen here just to kind of look at how you've had that defined. Typically, the way I look at this is a cluster development is still a subdivision. You know, if there's 4 lots that are clustered, then it could go as a minor. If it was more than 4, it could go as a major, just depending on that public dedication piece. But I look at it usually as more of a development type than a application process. So it's a way to subdivide the land versus just a standard subdivision. You're clustering the lots and leaving some open space. And so that's just one way to kind of think about it just in the interim, that it would still need to fall into one of these categories. It's kind of more like a design style that falls into one of these different application processes. But we can certainly cross-reference that a little bit more and just make sure we're not missing something.
Keep in mind too, we're talking about subdivision of land in this section of the code. In the zoning code too, or it will be, cluster development is a conditional use requiring a site plan. So we'll be able to get into the nitty-gritty details a little bit.
Yep,
So-
that agreed.
A clustered home development is a conditional use.
No, conditional use is specific category. It's not a specific, it's the same, cluster development's the same use. If it's a residential, means some of the houses are real close together because you got more space elsewhere.
I thought the process of cluster development was a conditional use.
I'm
Could be
looking,
wrong.
I'm looking right now.
Okay, sure.
Okay.
Let her check.
Same, I'm reading it right now. It's not actually clear.
Well, that's why I'm looking in the use table, Jen.
Okay. It is showing in your zoning. Currently, it's housed in your zoning chapter or zoning title
Yeah.
under the
it's
use regulations, which is interesting.
Clustered residential development, subject to section 18.33.125, is our favorite, permitted conditionally.
Oh, no.
Let's see, I'm double checking the zone because the way the code works, it doesn't travel with the page. Suburban residential and urban residential zone districts.
PC.
So it's permitted conditionally. And I know there's another
You
whole
got it.
section that provides criteria and such. Well, as it referenced, whatever that was, 18.33, whatever.
Mm-hmm. I have that section open right now.
Okay,
You know, the purpose is to provide for flexible and creative site design, permitting the clustering of houses and structures in order to reduce the amount of infrastructure improvements, to provide a diversity of lot sizes, a few
It is-
other items, but
Yeah,
there is a
it-
minimum, there's a minimum lot size of 5 acres.
for the parcel that the cluster lands on, yeah.
Yeah. Shall adhere to the following standards. density, the maximum number of dwelling units in the clustered development should not exceed the number of dwelling units otherwise permitted by the underlying zoning district. And the maximum height, same, shall match the underlying zoning district. You'll love this. Item C just says fencing and shrubbery. Let's see. And then there's other additional, notwithstanding any other contrary provisions contained within this code, the following standards shall apply to clustered developments. Again, setbacks, there's some setback information. Frontage, just making sure they have legal access. Housing type, 2-family dwellings may be permitted in a residential zoning district that does not otherwise allow attached dwelling units. Site density and open space requirements shall meet the section 1833-180, which is a different section. We have our land use intensity ratios that we've talked about in the past, parking requirements, street standards. And then there's the review criteria, which talks about planning commission makes a recommendation based on some criteria. I thought I saw in here, city council. Oh yeah, planning commission makes their recommendation to city council, who makes the final approval.
Maybe that's why I was mistaken with the condition.
Well, my notes from when we went through this table 4.02 was we decided to change that, or you all decided to change that to just conditional, not permitted conditionally.
The objective
That's
is to get rid of
Is
the
to get rid
permitted
of the permitted
conditionally.
conditionally, so then it's
Mhm.
still a conditional use. So you are correct, Larry.
So it was a long time.
I
ago.
know.
If it needs a conditional use permit, then it overlays everything with that provision, so that look at all the specific provisions and look more generally, is it in the best interest of the city?
Exactly.
So I'm just gonna throw this out there so I can get my own head around this. So you would have to go through a conditional use permit for the use. And then they still have to go through the subdivision process to define the plat. Is that correct, Karen?
Yes,
Okay,
and it would likely be reviewed concurrently
concurrently.
at
Yep.
the preliminary plat stage. So that right there would say this is probably needs to be a major subdivision.
Mm-hmm.
Logically, that's where you would want to look at the site plan associated with that before anything is finalized for recordation.
I will say in a lot of other communities, they actually encourage clustering, so they would not have that additional step of the conditional use. But I don't know if that's something we want to I don't know if that's open for discussion or not, if we want to just leave that alone.
I recall one request for conditional use here within the last quite a few years. And there was lots of public opposition, and it was never went
Really? For a
Absolutely.
cluster development?
for cluster development. This is one up off of
Interesting.
Majestic.
It bordered the national forest. That was the biggest
Yeah.
headache with everybody.
Yeah,
So-
do you guys remember what the opposition was? Were they planning, I know you can't plan denser development, but was that the
Basic idea is
perception?
opposition to what cluster development tends to mean. It's a number of units very close together,
Right,
lots of land behind it, including land unusable for building, kind of heading up the hill, counts
mhm.
in place of space between the houses, like, as they would say, every other house in the neighborhood seemed to have.
So
That
the
was
perception of density was the problem.
Yeah, okay, kind of like I was just saying, perception of density. Was there any concern about a fire risk or anything with the homes being closer together?
That was one of the issues, it was 21 clustered houses on 7 acres bordering the national forest.
Okay.
And it was heavily treed lots behind, the forest. Plus it was
Mhm.
access to the forest because the access road was going through the property, which was private property at that point. So there was an issue with that as well.
Okay. Good,
Do you-
good information. Always good to know.
You guys remember the name of that project?
Paradise something, Lee, do you remember?
I don't remember the name of it. I mean, I know exactly where it is.
I know exactly where it is too, and it was Mark McNabb that did
Traffic
it.
circle off of Majestic.
Yeah,
It was, if you went straight ahead, the next turn to the right,
yeah,
that land.
yeah. Yeah, Paradise was in the title, but I don't remember, Karen, and Mark McNabb was the developer.
Okay, and I just,
And it
at
was,
some point when I have like an extra 5 minutes and I'm bored, I'm just kind
well,
of
and
curious.
if I have the extra 5 minutes and get bored, I'll go look at my notes and I can probably find the name of it also.
Okay, yeah, because I'm just kind of curious to go back and look at the file just for historical context for myself, so. So this is what we have for you in terms of how we would like to restructure things, hopefully provide some clarity between processes, hold true to the process that's working for Woodland Park. So the things that you guys have typically not seen, you continue to not see. But the things that are, warrant your time and attention and you have been looking at, continue to bring those forward through that same path. But it really is about that clarity and distinction between those things. So that was the objective for this conversation, especially since we are, I guess, fairly substantially restructuring this. But it should be, in theory, much easier to follow. So comments, concerns, you guys are comfortable with us running with this?
I think it's reasonable, yes.
I had a couple more comments on subdivision.
Okay,
One is, where is the recording process going to be addressed? Will it be part of this table as well? The plats will be recorded?
plats have to be recorded if somebody wants to transfer a lot.
Mhm.
And that typically happens after the final plat, the documents all authorized, approved, and everybody signed it. I don't know that that'll show up in this table since that's,
But think about where the logical place for that to be.
yeah, it may just be part of the process of final plat since whether you're doing a major subdivision, a minor subdivision, or even that exemption plat, the document gets recorded, so.
Does our current subdivisions have provisions that say something to the effect that a subdivision is not fully approved until it is recorded?
I'd have to look.
Something like that. So
It-
we need to look for that.
Yeah, okay.
Another thing is we need to make a clear distinction. I've heard the word townhouse lot. I also heard somebody say town home. And I think our code has conflicting provisions. It says house and homes and places. So we're gonna call them a townhouse. We're gonna be consistent throughout the code.
And that may be just me, the speaker, using terms interchangeably and not specifically. But to your point, we will double check for consistency
Okay.
in the document.
And then my last thing is a pet peeve of mine is that when we talk about a town home or a townhouse lot, we may, sometimes it gets a little fuzzy if we're talking about the design of a certain residential structure. Design of a townhouse project. So we need to make a distinction of whether we're talking about houses or lots or a design. And maybe that's where townhomes come in. Townhomes, we're talking about a specific design similar to a patio home project or something like that.
Related to that last point, it's not clear to me that there's a change more than we talked about with respect to townhouse lots. The current service, since we're counting the townhouses, new projects must include a site plan. That has administrative review, That's now moved into townhouse lots, division of land to create individual townhouse lots. That's now changing the plat. And the current one talks about new project must include a site plan. My impression is that to create the townhouse lots. Now I understand that if you change your layout of the building design in some material way, the townhouse lots will probably have to be placed differently as well. But currently, does it go without going through the regular subdivision process, putting the townhouse lots in?
Yes.
It doesn't go through the subdivision process?
If it's a, like 2 acres, that's already a platted lot, the town home plat is handled purely administratively.
Okay. Surprised. We've seen them before, I guess, because they've been in project.
Well, it's a conditional use permit,
Well, conditional use permit, yeah, it's a different piece of.
so we would have overlooked at the overall thing, but I know the final plat for townhouses typically require a survey of the foundation, so the exact location of the property lines are defined. Contractors can adjust in the field or make mistakes, and it won't be exactly where the preliminary or the original plat, if we had a preliminary plat, would be. So going to the final plat, to me, is just a final adjustment after a conditional use has been approved.
I will, all I can say is we will dive into that in more depth and get you a real life example of what does this look like. The Grove at Spruce Haven, and I'm doing this from memory, which is like never good, because it's so weirdly specific. But the Grove at Spruce Haven was an early project after I started, and there was, I don't know, it was the conditional use. There was something that came through to you guys that you looked at, but the actual plat that got recorded related to those duplexes, you did not see that plat. That was handled administratively. But you saw the other part of it in its more preliminary stage.
That's why it's probably very important, Ken, like you said. Typically, those plats are provided after the building is built, because you're going to be changing the ownership.
Well, and I've seen that done 2 different ways, where there's some builders that are just that uber specific and able to
New
line,
technology. makes
you know,
it
they've
easy.
got the technology that they're out there with their transits and such, and it's like, no, this that they're able to get the common wall exactly where it needs to go. And then there's other folks that prefer to actually, like you're saying, get the foundation at least in, and then they're 99% of the way there, and then come back in and site in that common wall. And then that's what shows up on the plat. I mean, I've seen it done both ways.
But reviewing that final adjustment administratively, I don't have a problem with that. We don't want to come back and look at a 2-inch dimension change.
No.
No.
Agreed.
But it wasn't the dimension changes. It occurs to me certainly could be cases where the city council looking at it, if it was presented with a request for a conditional use permit for a particular development, might be interested to know what the development looked like. And not a representational drawing that it isn't really used for anything except Well, because a new one will be put out in the site plan review. And actual construction. But then the whole concept of conditional use permits for multifamily development has different reactions to it.
Any proposed changes then, or just kind of?
It's,
Well, and what is it what is the desired end result? What is the objective? Because I very much appreciate wanting clear oversight and making sure that conditions and details are addressed and taken care of. And you gotta also balance that with the developers need to keep things moving as quickly as possible. So Woodland Park tends to be fairly process heavy. And I know the developers would love to see less as usual in any community. So I guess I'd be cautious about proposing something more than what we've been doing because that may not get anything accomplished the way you want it to. I mean, that's where you need to have in my opinion, a pretty strong case for adding process. Or adding extra steps to an existing kind of procedure. So just a caution to consider. I'm not saying don't do it, but just consider it.
yeah, all right. No, and I was just looking at the subdivision exemption section of the proposed townhouse lots, division of land to create individual townhouse lots, each to accommodate a single household attached dwelling, includes cluster developments. City council has a role in this, I guess. I guess we've concluded has a role in it, is approving a conditional use permit. But the conditional use permit wouldn't, I guess it can be required that it match a particular site plan.
When you're looking at a type of a conditional use request, you would see a site plan with it because I can't imagine anybody saying, oh yeah, let's go ahead and throw 14 clustered homes out there and have no idea what that's going to look like on the ground.
Yeah. If that's the case, then the individual townhouse ones they have to, you implicit condition, which you just said, is that the townhouse plat will be consistent with the site plan plat layout that was seen in the conditional use permit.
There's a sketch plan review by staff, and they would be doing that comparison, I would anticipate.
Yeah, but the staff's ability to say yes and no tends to be constrained. If the staff is exercising judgment, people complain about that. It's not the result they want. I don't. Maybe it's not a problem.
Well, what is it you're wanting?
Be a preliminary plat review that you're looking for?
Yeah, I guess part of it, I didn't appreciate that there's no review by the city council, not to mention the planning commission, but there's no review by the city council of how townhouses are laid out in a property, except through a conditional use permit process, which is somewhat separated from, it's odd to call it conditional use because the use is a residential use, that's the use. We're saying a conditional use is how you lay the buildings out on in the plat.
Okay, so in our use table, multifamily dwelling units, 3 or more units, subject to condominium and townhome plats, section 17.32. Those are conditional uses. So you're essentially, the site plan and the plat are gonna be pretty darn consistent, because if they're not, then you got bigger problems.
Well, they should be substantially consistent.
Yeah,
There should be some room for a little adjustment.
so, and it gets reviewed at as part of the citing the use, that site plan, which then informs the plat, that gets reviewed at the conditional use.
Okay. And there needs to either be built into the ordinance or conditional use permit approval must expressly call out for what's actually allowed is something as provided in the site plan that was presented or substantially similar. I guess one can probably build that as a condition of the conditional use permit if the ordinance doesn't state it. Am I way off in left field here? It's a small topic. But it's small.
No, I know what you're after. You're wanting some type of clarity around the process, that when and how it gets reviewed, and that any conditions that are established early in the process follow through all the way to the end of the process. That's my understanding of what you're after. Yes? No?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
that's exactly, and somebody can't, towards the end of the process, say, I don't like that, I'm gonna come up with a new site plan, and you have to say, well, the site plan meets the normal standards a site plan would meet, and you're then, it's then incumbent on you to say, okay, even though it may look pretty darn different from what had been looked at in the first case.
Okay, so with these things that involve the conditional use permit, you know, the townhome condominiums, a criteria specific to those types of plats can be that it is consistent with the approved conditional use permit and associated site plan. That's where the criteria would live. It'd be with
And I'm sure there
the
could be
final
other
one.
ways to do that, but that would do that and it deals with the fact that this is the conditional use permit for a building layout, not a conditional use permit for a different use.
Well, it's a conditional use permit for the multifamily use and what it looks like on the ground, because quite
Yeah,
often
exactly,
you
and what it
guys
looks like
look
on
at
the ground.
both. There's a reason you ask for a site plan. You're not just blindly saying, oh, go ahead and put a Christmas tree farm over there. You want to know where the trees are going. Everybody's nodding yes, Jen. Which is understandable. I mean, that's part of what you guys want to look at. That's part of what's important to this community. I've had this chat with my team members that anytime we're getting stuff in, it's like, no, aesthetics are very important to this community. It doesn't quite show up that way in our current regulations, but that is a lot of what drives why you guys want to see as much as you do in a public hearing process, and why council wants the final say off on a lot of things, is that aesthetics are important. It doesn't show up in terms of standards and definitive things in terms of, hey, design it this way. That's a whole other series of outreach and code updates at some point. But at this point, we need a better structure. So that's my little soapbox. Nobody's arguing with the soapbox.
Your suggestion addresses it fine.
Okay, he says very quietly. Okay, so did you get that, Jen? For the townhome and condo plat approval criteria, we need to include a requirement that what's being proposed is consistent with the conditional use permit and associated site plan.
Yes,
Okay,
I used a tiny bit different language, but I just changed that, consistent with.
and I'm sure that may get modified in more detail when we're looking at the actual regs, but that's at least the intent of where we're starting there.
Okay.
And Councilmember Nakai is nodding yes too, so I don't know about Ken Kennedy online there. He's got just his frozen picture up, but he's pretty good about speaking up if he's got an opinion.
I'm here. I'm not sleeping. I'm here.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is what we had for subdivisions and where to go with this and hopefully streamline things, clean it up. And make it hopefully much easier for both the development community and staff and even the elected officials and y'all to use and follow. So we're good with that topic?
I think we can close that chapter, move on to the next.
Okay, so the next thing I put in front of you this evening, I apologize, it was not in your packet, but time did not allow for that, is another worksheet related to extending a previously granted approvals. A lot of those have an expiration date with them, which I personally think is a very good thing. Love it when things have that sunset clause, because I've worked in other communities where that was not there. And, you know, you're the new planner and somebody shows up and they're showing you approvals from like 18 years prior that somebody approved and it's a subdivision. And by God, I just need to get this recorded now. How are you going to help me? And you really don't want that kind of stuff hanging out there in perpetuity. So as much as it's a little tedious sometimes to go through the extension process, you know, it does have its advantages. So and our code is not as clear or specific on how to process some of these. So what you see in here is a combination between what's clearly spelled out in the code and then how we practice or how we've been doing things. So I don't, Jen, if you want to take us through the table.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And one thing that I do want to note, it's in italics here in both the PUD and the preliminary plat. Some communities do put a limitation on number of extensions, like you may request up to 2 one-year extensions or something. Your code just speaks to these extensions as, you know, you get your expiration of your document is 2 years. You can apply for a 2-year expiration or a 1-year extension, but there is no limitation on how many extensions people can get. So I just wanted to highlight that. That's something that's a little different from other codes. But planned unit development, your current code, most of your expiration or time limits are 2 years. So for a planned unit development or a PUD, they are required to begin construction within 2 years of approval, or approval will be considered void. They can apply for an extension. The extension would be for a 2-year, another, 2 years. So a 2-year extension. Planning Commission would make the recommendation to City Council. So your initial approval is review. This is one that wasn't in that previous table. So we wanted to highlight the initial approval of a PUD is review by staff, recommendation at a public hearing at public or Planning Commission, and then the decision goes to City Council. The extension request would be a review with staff and then public hearings at Planning Commission and City Council, with City Council being the final decision. So that's for that 2-year extension. And like I said before, there isn't in the code currently. I read through it several times and couldn't find anything that talks about a limit on number of extensions.
And I apologize, there's a typo in the table under initial approval there for PUD. That D should have the brackets around it for City Council, because that is a public hearing where they render that decision. So my apologies. Thanks for fixing
Perfect. That might have been one of the questions I had, actually. So thanks for clarifying that, Karen. This is another one of those things that in your code, sometimes it says at a public hearing and sometimes it just says, City Council for decision. So trying to understand what the practice is.
And Jen's right, there is times where it doesn't specify public hearing, but in practice, that is what happens. Which is it's a way of providing structure for that review and an opportunity for the community to provide comment and such. So, okay.
All right. Preliminary plat. Approval of the preliminary plat shall be valid, typo, for no longer than 2 years. So again, 2 years, at 2 years it expires. You may apply for a 1-year extension. No limit on number of extensions. And also submission of a final plat does extend that approval. So, you know, as you all know, a preliminary plat's followed by a final plat. So once that final plat is submitted, it kind of resets the clock. So they don't need to apply for an extension. Where multiple phases are involved, the preliminary plat automatically gains that extension of 1 year before another phase shall submit for a final plat. So you can submit for one phase of the final plat. And then that kind of, if you continue to submit final plats every year or thereabouts, then you're good. They don't have to apply for an extension. And the initial approval process, as we've talked about before, is review by staff, recommendation by planning commission, final decision at city council. The extension process is approved by planning commission. And I believe you guys have seen some of these recently.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if it's just the preliminary plat, it stops here, but there've been several occasions where it has included either the conditional use permit or it's been part of a PUD. So that's why you're recommending, and it ultimately goes on to city council because they're looking at the other aspects of it. And we've, at a staff level, just not split that apart between those hairs, that we've just treated you guys as recommendation and city council rendering that final decision.
Karen, I don't really object to this, and I'm sure the city council's got plenty of business to take care of, having to see these things. It is sort of a bit of an idiosyncrasy. We're an advisory body almost entirely, except in a slight, there's a little crease in the flood permit section we're having here on extension of a preliminary plat. I mean, I guess it seems okay, but it is odd. We put these things you can count on from the fingers of one hand, where we actually decide something that's supposed to recommend. And that's where it currently is. And I guess we can leave it because the city council doesn't want to hear about it. But
in
just an reality, they've been
observation. Hearing more of them than not, because like I said, it's been in combination with something else that requires their attention. I can see where it potentially, if it's just a preliminary plat, where it is potentially, you know, at a planning commission level, because it's one of those things where if nothing's changed, they're making progress. You know, it might as well give them more time to keep working on this. What's not great is we don't have like criteria around some of that. So then you can end up with these things hanging out there for extensions for a very
one thing
long
which
time.
is left out of the preliminary plat item that was in the PUD one, and I think should be in all of these things. One has to apply before the original time limit is expired.
Yeah.
You apply, I mean, we had a vote failed on a closed vote several years ago on one where it was extended on something that had actually been void for some months. I think we should clarify that.
You know, that's on my personal fantasy list, just a couple of basic criteria for any extension. You know, and I think it's actually down at the bottom, the special use permit is the one that actually had some criteria associated with extending it. And that is what you're talking about. Did they turn the application in on time? Have they been making progress or doing something, anything? Yeah, that there's some pretty easy criteria we can get drafted, so it's part of any extension request.
Of what you just suggested, a big change, you say that they made progress.
Well, and it's just
That's-
a place to start. You guys can, when we get you some verbiage, you
It gives us
can
something to
tell
talk
us.
about, because that's
Yeah.
what we're always asking. Nothing's happened, but can't guarantee that sometime 10 years from now, something might happen.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of those.
Yeah, and this is all based on your current language, and you're right, in the preliminary plat, I was just double checking it. It just states 1 year extensions of time may be applied for in writing to the planning commission. And it doesn't state, you know, before the expiration date or anything, so. We would definitely, when we roll this in to the new draft, make that consistent throughout.
The other item which I'd raise on this is for preliminary plat, the extensions are 1 year, all the other extensions are 2 years. Now it's embedded as part of the process which just summarized for us that There's automatic 1-year extensions if you final pieces of it. But are the circumstances different enough for preliminary plat that it should be 1 year and every other permission is for 2 years?
Is the 1 year there just to kind of keep them spurred on proceeding?
No idea.
I agree with Lee. I think it ought to be consistent throughout all
Yeah.
these processes. And it ought to be 2 years.
Okay.
Agreed with that.
Jen, did you get that?
I did. I'm typing that up right now.
Yeah, and that's, part of the reason for doing these conversations is, and that's been a big challenge around the restructuring is trying to analyze, so what are we doing and what does it look like between processes to ideally get to more consistency? So that's, sometimes you got to spell it out in terms of like where the disconnects are to build that consensus around, okay, yeah, we really do want to like streamline this and get rid of the one-off. So thank you for that.
Is there an argument for capping the number of extensions? Because I know Jen said something about, I mean, what's the argument for that? Because I know there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. And is it usually in other communities, they're just a lot bigger, so they have a lot more to review and it just bogs them down if you keep extending it? But
Mechanism to maybe encourage the developer to not apply for something when they don't mean it. I mean, sometimes there are market conditions that happen that change when somebody wants to do something. And then there are occasions where somebody, okay, I got my entitlement and now I'm going to sit on it and I'm like shopping that to other developers to let them take the project home. And sometimes that sale doesn't happen at all quickly. Yeah, Jen, what else have you seen?
Yeah, similar. And with language, what I've seen is that a lot of times the extensions are processed just by the planning director in some communities, but that's neither here nor there. But that the extensions could be granted. If you limit the number of extensions, you can always have a clause in there that says additional extensions can be granted for good cause. And any of the lawyers in the room will know you can define what good cause is or just cause. But yeah, I think a lot of times you're trying to encourage them to continue to move along with the development. So you can always have an out in there for the people who are just not, the situations that Karen gave really, market conditions change, something catastrophic happens, it's just not feasible at the time. We just need a little bit more time, something like that. And a lot of people will allow up to 2 extensions is what I've seen in a lot of codes. Some codes are very restrictive on extensions, but usually I see up to 2 additional extensions on any kind of application.
Which is 6 years.
Yeah.
So what were you going to say, Lee?
No, I like the language that Karen suggested about substantial progress. Substantial progress is made, but in no event more than 2 extensions, something like that. So if you just say 2 extensions without putting some
Condition.
something that had to happen, you're going to get, well, I'm entitled to 2, right? I mean, at least the feeling that you should get 2. Right.
Okay.
And I like the idea too that the first extension can be reviewed and approved by staff. It doesn't have to be reviewed by planning commission or city council. Then we put a cap on the number of extensions.
Other thoughts on that?
You just took the words out of my mouth, Karen.
So just to recap what I'm understanding Larry saying is somebody gets their initial approval, 2 years go by, they say, hey, staff person, director or designee, can you give me another 2-year extension? That gets handled administratively. Another 2 years go by, And then it's like, oh no, I need another extension. It's like, well, this time you get to ask planning commission and city council what that looks like. And there are 2 extensions. And then let's say, oh no, I didn't get anything done at all. I really need this 3rd extension. So they can potentially apply, and that's what gets into Jen's language about needing to somehow show good cause for why they really need that 3rd extension. And that would definitely be a hearing item.
I was suggesting more along the lines of to get any extensions, they show substantial progress to get there. Otherwise, the staff is gonna say, have to say yes. And you got, and the second one is the last one, the second one's the last one yet. If, as long as there's some standards, something that had to be shown to the staff, I wouldn't object to letting go to the staff and not have to go.
Yeah, you've got a
Planning commission.
grading plan approved, that's substantial moving forward.
Although we are losing, and just looking back at the table, the decision by planning commission's got the brackets on it, reflecting it's a public hearing. Are we losing something for the neighbors to come in and object?
I'm just thinking that it's kind of reasonable to be able to have standards for an extension, and the staff can do that the first time. The second time, it needs to go through the public hearing process. And then there's no 3rd time unless there's, like you said.
Because it's gonna be, I'd say no 3rd time, but they can apply again at that point. I mean, that's,
Well, no, if the code says you can't do it, you can't apply for it.
Well, you can
start all
reapply.
over
If
again.
can
the
reapply.
second extension expires and they want to move forward with the project, they have to go back through the whole
Process again.
process.
Yeah.
Reevaluate.
Yep,
I give you some motivation.
go back to square
Yeah,
one.
that would be motivation.
yeah,
And they could
lot of financial.
essentially resubmit the same drawings.
Yep,
If they were really ready to go, but the odds are they aren't.
No,
Assuming no codes have changed in that. kind of thing.
correct.
Right.
So the extensions, if codes change, and we have granted an extension, then the new codes may not apply.
Correct.
Building codes would probably be.
Building codes are a
would
little,
apply.
little different
But
because
as far as
chances
the
are they don't
zoning
have a,
codes-
because you either have a building permit or you don't.
Yeah.
And the code in place when you get the building permit is what carries you through to the end of that project.
When you submit for building
I mean,
permits.
unless you let the permit expire, and then I'm less clear on what happens at that point.
If our setbacks change or something like that for whatever reason, the planning from 5 years ago, they'd have to, we could put that condition on it, but
Well, let's say something does get approved and then 3 years in, there's a code change that changes dimensional standards or something that would impact their site plan if they were applying new. If there's an extension, you're extending the prior approval. You're not saying, oh, no, redesign this to the code change.
but we can deny that extension and then we have to reapply with the new dimensional standards.
Correct.
But those, I mean, that's one of the two main reasons why it's a problem having extensions continue forever. Somebody years after an ordinance changes, they no longer have to, they don't have to comply with what everybody else does, and even though it's some years later. Second thing is the factual situation, the uses around it, the buildings around it, whatever else has changed.
A project that was designed 20 years ago may not fit into the current.
And
Exactly.
I've seen enough of these things before the planning commission, when it comes up. I've asked the question, what is our standards? And nobody ever wants to sort of say, is this a good idea? It's more, it's like, we would be bad guys if we didn't just extend it indefinitely.
Well, and right now, it's definitely challenging for you all because you don't have that criteria in place. If you had criteria to point to, I think it'd be a lot easier to say, Mr. Applicant, I'm sorry, you have fallen short. You have not shown us that you're able to do A, B, and C. You know, so that's where you guys struggle right now. So for the purposes of us preparing a draft, Do you want all extension requests to go through a hearing process, or do you want anything at all administrative? I mean, because we can write it either way. We just need to know what you want to see.
Again, I would advocate the first one be reviewed administratively.
First one administrative?
Okay with me.
Okay,
I don't have a problem with it.
okay. So that gives us
right.
guidance. First extension's administrative. The developers will love that, by the way. The second one is public hearing. And we'll get criteria for both of those. Probably the same criteria, quite
Substantial
honestly.
progress is made towards
Yep.
the,
Yeah.
towards the requested use. Yep.
And during
And
that,
no
hear-
more than two, and no more than two.
right?
Yeah.
And we can sit there at that public hearing for that extension and say, this is your last extension.
Is it?
This is it. Come back with a new application next time.
I'm sure they're gonna come back.
Yeah.
Never get the project done because they're not gonna come back.
Okay. So
Perfect.
this is actually a good point to segue into, and I think that really applies to conditional use permit and special use permit, because they're very, very similar.
Yes.
So I don't know that we need to dive into those too much more. So this chart mostly just helps you understand what's in the current code, what those processes look like or don't, what's specified or not. Yeah, and actually special use permit extensions, Lee, that's another one that, that's one of your three on the one hand that planning commission actually has decision-making authority according to the code. Is for an extension of those. Luckily, there's not too many things that go through a special use permit, so the odds of you ever seeing one of those are pretty small. So if we're good with that, I want to circle back to final plats. So here in Woodland Park, those do not expire. So in theory, somebody can get their final plat blessed off by planning commission, city council, and then it just doesn't get recorded. And that approval hangs out there. You know,
What a
unless
me- what
there's,
a mess that creates.
exactly,
What if it
unless
bur- what
there's
if it
built
burns up too,
in,
then
you know, a sunset clause of, you know, this approval will expire, and you can be generous. I mean, you can give them 24, 36 months. I mean, so they got plenty of time to do whatever they want to do, because sometimes they're not wanting to bond for infrastructure or produce a letter of credit, but they're wanting to work on all that. So there's ideally a subdivision development agreement that spells out all the improvements and stuff they're building. And so your hammer is the plat, and it may take them 2 building seasons to get all of that infrastructure constructed without needing to produce any type of financial guarantees, get it all blessed off by the city, and then they get their plat recorded to sell lots. So I'm actually okay with a longer window on that, but I do think it needs a sunset clause.
I see your
Yep.
point there.
I'm sorry, Don, speak up.
I said, I see your point.
So it could be approved by council, the final review, but then you're not gonna sign off on the document until the conditions of approval.
Until the construction,
with.
any infrastructure is complete, you know, if they're installing roads, utilities, that kind of thing. The plat actually doesn't get, or if it does get, even if the mayor signs it, we sit on it and it doesn't get recorded. You know, not until,
Are you aware of plats that have gone more than 24 months, more than 36 months?
I think 36 is a safe number, and the reason I say that is I want to make sure they have 2 full building seasons up here at elevation.
Mhm.
I'm trying to be sensitive to our climate. And I do think maybe the ability to ask for a 1-year extension, that may be the one where we, a 2-year extension. Well, and if you want to reduce that down to 2 and 2, like everything else, that's fine too, you know, so it's a 2-year initial approval to get everything done and your plat recorded, and then the ability to ask for, you know, a
If you're
2-year
gonna extend
extension.
it 2-year plus an extension of 2-year, that keeps our 2-year rule.
Yeah.
And that ought to be clear enough if they've made, if they're pouring concrete for the road, we can see they're doing something. If it's still forest, they're not. If the issue were infrastructure.
which is typically what it is, you know, you guys see this all the time, that development is time consuming and very expensive. Capital intensive, that's the phrase I use a lot. Yeah, takes lots of money and lots of time to get stuff done. You can make quite a bit of money, but it takes both of those other two things. So.
Karen, can we circle back to one thing? And I know you and I can talk offline more about this, but you said that you guys hold on the recording. When do you finally record? Is it once you said it, I think a few minutes ago, I just didn't quite catch it.
There's two options. If they have a subdivision development agreement with financial guarantees,
Mm-hmm.
we will record the plat and the SDA agreement concurrently.
Okay.
If for some reason they're not wanting to come up with a letter of credit, bond, other financial guarantee for the infrastructure, they're under our rules, they are able to actually build and construct, but we would not record the plat because you don't want them selling lots without a financial guarantee in place to complete
Right.
all the infrastructure.
Okay. That's what I thought I heard you say. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's pretty standard, you know, around that. And then what happens is, to carry this forward, if there is a subdivision development agreement that's recorded with the plat, down the line, when all that construction's completed and everything's good to go, we actually go back and file a release of that SDA. So at some point when somebody's buying a lot, you know, every once in a while you see this where somebody comes in and is like, oh my God, there's this SDA from 94 out there. How do I get this cloud off my title? You know, because the roads have been there, there's houses that have been there for decades. So it really is a pretty easy document for us at the city to just file in the real property records that then clears that up.
And the city can do that at their own accord. It doesn't have to be a request of the developer, right?
Correct. Yeah, no, it's something that
That-
we as the city have to record
Good.
and draft and record. Yep. Yeah. So. Okay.
Anything else?
Can I ask a quick?
Sure,
Please.
Catherine.
So I just wanted to make sure when you do this and you put all of the language together, so basically everything's gonna be 2 years and 2 years, but you're also going to put in that they must make the application for the extension prior to the expiration
Yes.
on all of them, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I see, quite honestly, I see us potentially having like one section on extension requests, especially since this is so similar. That extension requests apply to the following application extensions. These are the criteria, this is the process. So you're not hunting and pecking, because then there's potential when you've got things that are, you've got a PUD out there, and then you've got a preliminary plat, and when those don't line up, and the review bodies are different, and then at the staff level, your head's exploding trying to reconcile which one do you follow, and it's never good. So I think quite possibly we can really streamline this into one section related to extension of prior approvals.
Just to clarify too, as far as who's doing, and Kath, I'm interested in your thoughts on this too, because two of them require the city council to approve the extension, the PUD amendment and the conditional use permit. Some was just this planning commission. We sort of said, when I think we're all nodding our heads agreeing that administrative is fine for the first extension, planning commission with the second extension. Should the city councils, should we have that different for the city council's approval of PUD amendments and conditional use permits, or to treat, would those make sense to treat the same way? So
I mean, I would think that you just treat them all the same.
Yep.
Whether if it's an extension for a CUP for the first time, you guys decide. If it's an
and they've made substantial
and they've made
progress.
substantial progress, you guys decide. And then, I mean, I think if we're consistent down the road with everything 2 and 2, and however you do it, I think it's easier. for all of us and the developers.
Okay,
And you're right, Lee. I mean, if we make one change here in this table, it's going to have a ripple effect on other changes in the code that we just forgot about for now, but they're out there.
Although not so much in this, as Karen suggested, that there's a section specifically on extensions.
Yeah.
If we mean it as we sound like we're doing, them, they'll all be the same. That can be a pretty concise little section there.
Yeah.
I saved us 50 pages.
Yep. Karen, does the department have a suspense calendar? Do you keep a track of some of these dates? Or does the applicant developer come in and say, oh, I got my approval about 2 years ago. Do I have to request an extension?
We kind of keep a little track, but not a formal suspense calendar. I'm hoping with our new tracking software, when we get that up and running, that is a mechanism we can use within that to keep that more obvious and clear. Right now, some of it's just because it's small and the projects are definitive, it's a little easier at a staff level, but we also take the position, it's the developer, the applicant's responsibility. Though the one time recently where we stepped out in front of that was related to Fred's Towing, because we recognized, oh wait, we have been working on this with these guys. They have consistently had stuff in here, and tracking that kind of deadline was not their strong suit. But like I said, they had been working, so that's where we, at a staff level, we're willing to go out there a little bit on their behalf. But otherwise, if you've done nothing during that time period, it's like it's yours, man.
I think it's a good public service action to be able to put that together and say, you know, you were in here almost 2 years ago and it's going to expire.
Yeah,
I think it's good public relationship.
and we've effectively done that, and
Yeah, okay.
even on, even on one where nothing's happened, you know, they were very aware of where they were.
Okay,
Yeah, and we had talked about it at a,
but still, another reminder is always
Yeah.
helpful.
thank you. So that's it on extensions, unless you guys have something else.
Hey Larry, to your point, it's a nice feature, but it doesn't guarantee that they get the extension if they miss the deadline.
No,
It's still on them.
no,
Yeah.
they still have to apply, they
Yeah,
still have to
okay.
go through the
Just
process.
making sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, people run around with expired car tags all the time. They get reminders.
Is there anything else, Karen?
I did want to touch on one last thing, and that's the PUD process in general. That's one of the things that, as I joked with Jen, it's like one of the elephants in the room we've been ignoring. And when you read through that section of our code, it leaves quite a bit to be desired. And I want to back up here a little bit. In the world of planned unit developments here in the state of Colorado, there are two basic ways that those can be addressed. Because it is essentially a rezoning to allow somebody to customize the zone district for their development. And the two types are when somebody does an overlay zone. So, you know, that neighborhood commercial is still under there, but I'm gonna impose this additional PUD overlay that provides other criteria and things that I want to do. I've even seen that where all of the uses in the underlying zone are still there, or you're limited to those. There's interesting ways to do that. In Woodland Park, we are set up where you actually rezone to a PUD designation. And that is actually my preference, to stay with that. And with that, you're essentially going through multiple steps where you're rezoning the property to the PUD. You've got that PUD plan, which goes with that zone designation. So what is this going to look like? What are our setbacks? What are our height requirements? Are there any additional landscaping things that need to be met? All that should get spelled out in the PUD. We do have a couple in town that are old and do not have the luxury of that type of detailed information associated with them. So that's a little nerve-wracking for staff when questions come up with those. But anyhow, when you get the parameters of the zone established, sometimes they're needing a plat. sometimes they're subdividing further into smaller lots. Stone Ridge is a very large PUD. And you see them coming back in with additional filings and such. So you have the potential, well, and then, you know, that preliminary plat a lot of times is run, from what I can tell, I think happens with the plan of development and the rezoning. I think those have been run concurrently before. And then there's ultimately the final plat or final and our code also talks about preliminary versus final development plans. There's also a weird reference to a planned business development. There's no definitions. It's kind of this weird little subset sentence that's like, what? So the bottom line is, the process we practice is fairly close to that that rezoning and establishing a PUD, that kind of thing. And since I think there's standards within there that we will pull out and save, you know, because there's like the requirement for residential development that even when a PUD, you can't have more than 2 dwelling units per acre. You know, we recognize that nobody likes density, so we'll make sure that shows up. But to go and draft different language, look at some other industry standards, get a more clear process, you know, out of that based on kind of how we've been practicing things. And like I said, I just didn't spend the time and effort to try and outline what it appears we have been doing historically. Never mind what the code says, because that would have been pretty time intensive. And I'm looking for you guys to go, oh yeah, just bring us something that's clear and articulate, please, without having to go through that particular exercise for y'all. I mean, if you want us to, we'll give it our best shot, but I would appreciate the shortcut.
See what you come up with.
I think it's very important that at the time we rezone a piece of property to PUD, the city understands what will happen with that property. And we can do that with a preliminary PUD plan. And that would be for the entire 1,800 acres. And then at the time, the developer wants to develop a part of that 1,800 acres, maybe 50 acres of that, then a final development plan would be required.
Okay, that was helpful. Did you catch that, Jen?
That's pretty much what you were asking for, wasn't it?
That works. I don't know what I was asking for, but that works.
Okay.
I think it was mostly asking for direction that, yeah, go ahead and pull something together.
So
But
your,
that
my
guidance,
understanding is your staff was going to come up with a new proposal rather than document the procedures that have been used in the past.
or try and dive into the exact details of what it says versus what we've been doing versus, but yeah, to your point, at the time of rezone, a very clear preliminary plan for the PUD. And then when somebody is actually ready to construct, they need approval of a final development plan for that phase.
Yep.
All right. I have typed that up off to the side, Karen.
Okay,
I can add it to this document if you want me to.
so long as you got it somewhere. So that's all I had for you guys this evening. I appreciate your grace with the 2 pile-ons from what actually went out in your packet for you to think about prior to this meeting. These were some of the bigger parameters I think that we needed for drafting language and pulling things together for y'all.
Well, that takes us to reports. Anything to share with us beyond tonight's discussion?
No. Right now, we are planning your next meeting would be another work session. Hopefully have some draft language out to you all. I will be at the state APA planning conference in the next week. So that will be good and interesting because I need continuing education credits.
Very good. Commissioners have anything to share? Seeing none? I guess Ken's still out there, so, but it's 8:15 and meeting's adjourned.
Thanks all. Have a good evening.